When I moved into her house, I thought I was just renting a room. But the landlady's smile, it felt like she was giving me something I didn't know I was missing. I didn't expect moving into a new apartment to feel so personal. Usually, these things are quick: sign some papers, get the keys, drag your boxes upstairs, and start living. But when I met her, the landlady, it didn't feel like a transaction. It felt like stepping into someone's carefully built world. She opened the door before I even knocked properly. A woman in her early 40s, maybe mid, with the kind of presence you can't ignore. Not loud or overbearing, just composed. The kind of grace that makes you straighten up without realizing. Her hair, dark with soft hints of silver near the temples, was tied back loosely, though a few strands had escaped and framed her face in a way that felt unintentional but perfect. "You must be the new tenant," she said, her voice warm yet steady. I nodded, suddenly aware of how young and awkward I must have looked with a backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder and a half-crushed cardboard box in my hands. She smiled then, not a forced, professional smile, but one that lit up her whole expression, crinkling gently at the corners of her eyes. And as she handed me the keys, she added with a teasing tilt of her head, "Don't worry, I don't charge extra for smiles, yet." I laughed, though it came out more nervous than smooth. She had caught me off guard. Not just the joke, but the ease with which she made it. The hallway behind her smelled faintly of fresh tea and something floral, jasmine, maybe. The space wasn't grand or modern, but it had character: polished wooden floors with tiny creaks, framed photographs lining the walls, curtains that looked handmade rather than store-bought. It felt lived in, cared for. She gestured for me to step inside so she could show me around. As I followed, I noticed the way she moved, calm, confident, yet with a softness that made the whole place feel welcoming. She pointed out the kitchen, the courtyard outside, and finally the small upstairs unit I'd be renting. Her voice carried a rhythm, not rushed, not overly polite, just genuine. At one point, while explaining how the water heater worked, she brushed past me to reach the switch. The brief contact, her shoulder against my arm, was nothing more than accidental. Still, I felt it. A subtle warmth that lingered far longer than it should have. I tried to keep my focus on the details, the rent schedule, the trash collection days, the quirks of the old building, but I kept stealing glances at her. The curve of her lips when she spoke, the quick wit in her tone, the way she seemed perfectly comfortable in her own skin. She wasn't trying to impress me, and maybe that's what made her so magnetic. When she finished the tour, she paused at the door, almost as if testing the air between us. "Well," she said, folding her arms lightly, "I hope you'll find it comfortable here. It's quiet most of the time. But if you need anything, I'm just downstairs." I thanked her, perhaps too earnestly, and she gave another one of those smiles, the kind that seemed both playful and knowing. And then, before I could even settle in properly, I realized something unsettling: I was already thinking about her. Not just as a landlady. Not even just as an attractive woman. But as someone who, in the span of 10 minutes, had unsettled my calm routine with a joke, a smile, and a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as I unpacked my boxes and listened to the faint creak of the old house, I caught myself smiling at the thought of her words. "I don't charge extra for smiles, yet." And I knew, whether I wanted it or not, this place was going to be more than just an apartment. The first week in the new place went by in a blur of cardboard boxes, grocery bags, and adjusting to the rhythm of a house that wasn't entirely mine. Yet, no matter how much I busied myself, I couldn't ignore the quiet presence of my landlady. Our interactions were small, ordinary even, but they stayed with me. I'd hear the soft sound of her watering can early in the morning, the faint creak of the courtyard gate as she stepped outside to tend the plants. When I came back from errands, I'd find her returning from the market with a woven basket balanced against her hip, moving with the calm certainty of someone who knew every corner of this neighborhood by heart. Each time our eyes met, there was always a smile. Sometimes polite, sometimes amused, sometimes warmer than I expected. I began to look forward to those fleeting exchanges, though I'd never admit it out loud. One evening, as I wrestled with a bag of groceries that tore open on the staircase, she appeared out of nowhere. I had cans rolling down the steps, apples bouncing dangerously close to escape. She crouched down without hesitation, her slender fingers reaching to catch one before it could roll into the courtyard. "You look like you're losing a battle," she teased, handing it back. I laughed, embarrassed. "I swear the bags were fine when I left the store." "Well," she said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, "this house has a way of humbling its tenants. Even the grocery bags know it." There it was again, her wit, so quick yet never unkind. She carried the rescued apples up the stairs while I gathered the rest, and together we managed to restore order to the chaos. That small moment opened the door for something more. A few days later, as I came home from a long day of classes, she called out from her doorway. "Would you like some tea? It's a shame to let it go cold when I've made too much." I hesitated for only a second before agreeing. Stepping into her apartment felt different, not like a tenant entering a landlord's space, but like being welcomed into someone's private sanctuary. The air smelled faintly of jasmine tea and something sweet baking in the oven. The living room was warm, lit by soft golden lamps rather than harsh overhead lights. On the walls were framed photographs, landscapes, family, moments of life captured in quiet dignity. She set 2 porcelain cups on the low table between us, the delicate clink filling the silence. "This house can feel too big when it's quiet," she admitted, settling across from me with effortless poise. "Sometimes it's nice to share a cup with company." Her words carried a softness, almost like she was confessing more than just a preference for tea. As I took my first sip, I found myself watching the way she cradled her cup, both hands wrapped around it, like she was drawing warmth into herself. A strand of hair slipped free from her bun, falling against her cheek. I noticed it, and for a moment, I wanted to reach out and brush it back for her. But of course, I didn't. Instead, I asked about the photographs. She lit up, telling me stories about places she had visited, memories with friends, fragments of a life I hadn't expected her to share so easily. Her laughter filled the room, light and genuine, and I realized how rare it was for me to sit with someone and feel time slipping away unnoticed. When the clock struck 10, I stood reluctantly, thanking her for the tea. She smiled, her eyes lingering on mine for a second longer than necessary. "You're welcome anytime," she said. "A house shouldn't feel lonely, not when there are people to fill it." As I walked back upstairs, cup of warmth still in my chest, I caught myself thinking not about the house or the tea, but about her. The woman downstairs who carried herself with elegance and humor, who seemed to weave comfort into the very air around her. And though I had just begun to settle into this place, I realized something quietly startling: I wasn't only settling into the house. I was settling into her presence. By the 3rd week, the apartment no longer felt strange. My things were unpacked, my routines had settled, and the creaks of the old wooden stairs no longer startled me at night. But more than the walls or furniture, it was her, the landlady, who made the place feel alive. Our paths crossed in ways that felt too natural to be chance. She always seemed to appear when I needed her most, sometimes with a teasing comment, sometimes with a helping hand. And little by little, those small moments stitched themselves into something I began to crave. One afternoon, I was wrestling with a stubborn curtain rod in my room. It tilted sideways no matter how many times I adjusted it, and after 30 minutes of failure, I muttered a curse under my breath. Right then, there was a knock on my door. "Everything all right up here?" she asked, peeking in with that half-amused smile she always carried. I sighed dramatically. "Unless you want to watch me lose my sanity to a curtain rod, I'd say no." She chuckled, stepping inside. "Hopeless handyman, huh? Move aside." Without hesitation, she rolled up the sleeves of her blouse and took the screwdriver from my hand. Her fingers brushed mine briefly, just enough for me to feel the coolness of her skin. She climbed onto the chair with a confidence that made me smile, and within minutes, the curtain was perfectly straight. There, she said, stepping down. Sometimes it just needs a firmer hand. I laughed. And here I was thinking I had it under control. She looked at me, tilting her head playfully. Don't worry. Not everyone's good with their hands. Her words lingered longer than they should have. I didn't reply, but the warmth in her eyes made it clear she knew the effect she had. A few days later, it was my turn to surprise her. I had noticed she often carried a small paper bag from the bakery down the street, the kind that smelled faintly of butter and sugar. Curious, I stopped by the shop one morning and discovered her favorite pastry, a golden, flaky croissant dusted with powdered sugar. That evening, I knocked on her door and held it out, pretending nonchalance. Thought you might like this. They had fresh ones today. Her eyes softened instantly, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. She took it gently, as though it were something more than just a pastry. You noticed? I shrugged, though my chest tightened at the way she was looking at me. You always seem to have one, so I guessed it must be your favorite. She smiled, a quiet, almost vulnerable smile that made her seem younger in that moment. Thank you, she said, her voice softer than usual. We sat in her living room again, sharing tea while she savored the pastry. The buttery sweetness flaked across her fingertips, and she laughed when I teased her about the powdered sugar smudging the corner of her lip. She dabbed it away, still smiling, and I felt a warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the tea. The sun was setting through the curtains, painting the room in shades of amber and rose. She leaned back, sighing in contentment, and for a moment, it felt like time had slowed down just for the two of us. It struck me then, how these gestures, so small on the surface, carried something weightier underneath. Her fixing my curtain rod. My bringing her pastry. They weren't grand acts, but they were deliberate, thoughtful. A silent language of care, exchanged without needing to be named. When I finally returned upstairs, I caught myself smiling again. The apartment no longer felt like just a place I was renting. It felt like I was being welcomed into someone's life, step by step, gesture by gesture. And the more it happened, the harder it became to tell myself this was simply a tenant-landlady arrangement. It was becoming something more, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable that it was late when I noticed the faint glow from the courtyard. Most nights, the old house settled into silence after 10, the wooden floors sighing and the walls holding their breath. But that evening, soft candlelight flickered through the downstairs window, pulling me from my desk. Curiosity, or maybe something more, led me to step outside. There she was, sitting at the wrought iron table beneath the vine-draped trellis, a half-empty glass of red wine in front of her. The night air was cool, carrying the faint perfume of jasmine from the plants she tended so carefully. She didn't look surprised to see me, but she didn't exactly look prepared either. You're still awake? I asked softly, not wanting to disturb the quiet she seemed wrapped in. She smiled faintly, her expression tinged with something I hadn't seen before. Sometimes sleep takes its time. A glass of wine helps, or so I tell myself. I hesitated, then pulled out the chair across from her. Do you mind if I join? She shook her head. Not at all. The courtyard doesn't belong only to me. For a while, we sat in easy silence. The candlelight danced between us, shadows flickering on her face, softening the lines that spoke of life lived fully, joys, worries, responsibilities. There was a fragility to her in that moment, as though the composure she usually wore had slipped. You ever feel, she began, swirling the wine in her glass, that a house can be too quiet? Too heavy with silence? I nodded slowly. Sometimes. Especially when you've been alone in it too long. Her eyes lifted to mine, and in them I saw something raw. She gave a small laugh, but it was the kind people use to cover what they don't want to reveal too much of. This house has seen more people come and go than I can count. Families, couples, students, and me, still here, making tea and fixing curtain rods. There was no bitterness in her voice, just an echo of weariness. I didn't know what to say at first. Words felt clumsy in the face of the quiet honesty she was offering. So instead, I listened. She took another sip of wine, then set the glass down carefully. It's funny. People think being alone is the same as being lonely. But they're not always the same thing. She paused, her gaze drifting toward the candle. Though sometimes they overlap. The vulnerability in her admission settled heavily in the air. I wanted to reach across the table, to place my hand over hers, but I wasn't sure if it would be welcome. Instead, I shrugged off my coat and gently draped it over her shoulders. She startled slightly, then looked at me, her eyes softening. You didn't have to. I know, I said quietly. But you looked cold. Her lips curved into a small smile, gentle, tired, but genuine. She held the coat tighter around herself, as though it wasn't just fabric but something else, reassurance, presence. We didn't speak much after that. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore, it was warm, like an unspoken agreement that words weren't always necessary. The night air carried the faint sounds of the city in the distance, but here, in the courtyard, it felt like we were in a world of our own. When she finally stood to go inside, she paused, looking at me for a moment longer than usual. There was something in her gaze, a question, a hesitation, a quiet thanks she didn't voice. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," I echoed, watching as she disappeared behind the doorway. I stayed in the courtyard long after she left, staring at the candle's last flicker until it went out. And in the silence that followed, I realized something. I wasn't just drawn to her smile, her wit, or even her presence. I was drawn to her hidden fragility, the part of her she rarely showed, but had trusted me with tonight. And that trust meant more than I could put into words. The storm arrived without warning. I had been working at my desk, rain hammering against the windows, when suddenly the room fell dark. The old building groaned as the lights flickered, then died altogether. I sat there in the silence, listening to the hum of the storm and the occasional roll of thunder, trying to remember where I'd left the candles I had bought just in case. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps on my door, almost hesitant. When I opened it, she stood there holding a single candle, its flame casting golden shadows across her face. The light softened her features, making her eyes glow in a way that made my chest tighten. "Well," she said, smiling with a touch of nervousness, "seems the house has decided to test us tonight." I stepped aside, and she entered, her presence bringing with it a sense of calm that even the storm couldn't unsettle. The candlelight filled the small room, flickering across the books stacked on my desk and the unmade bed in the corner. She glanced around, then set the candle on the table between us. "I've lived here long enough to know these outages can last hours," she explained, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "It's always easier to wait it out with company." I nodded, grateful she had chosen my door. We sat at the table, the storm raging outside while our small circle of light held steady within. She told stories about other blackouts she had endured in this house, how once she had read by candlelight until dawn, another time she had played cards with neighbors by the faint glow of lanterns. Her laughter filled the space, weaving warmth into the storm's roar. At some point, I leaned closer to hear her better over the rain. She leaned closer too. The distance between us shrank until it felt charged, as though even the air was aware of how near we were. When she reached across to adjust the candle's wick, her fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, really, an accident. But neither of us pulled away. Her skin was cool against mine, delicate but steady. The contact lasted only a moment before she withdrew, but in that single second, something shifted. The quiet companionship we had built over weeks deepened into something unspoken, heavier, undeniable. I tried to focus on the storm outside, but every sense was tuned to her presence, the faint scent of her perfume, the soft sound of her breathing, the glow of candlelight painting gold across her skin. After a pause that stretched longer than it should have, she gave a small laugh, though it sounded more like a way to ease the tension than true amusement. "It's strange," she murmured, her gaze lingering on the flame. How easy it feels, sitting here like this. As if the world outside doesn't exist. I swallowed, my voice lower than I intended. Maybe it doesn't. Not tonight. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for a moment, we simply looked at each other. Neither of us moved, but everything in that silence spoke louder than words. The storm continued, the thunder rolling, the rain thrashing against the windows. But in that room, with that candle between us, it felt as though we were holding back something stronger, something neither of us had the courage, or permission, to name. When the lights finally flickered back on an hour later, it almost felt wrong. The magic of the moment broke, replaced by the ordinary hum of electricity and the soft whir of appliances. She stood, smoothing her blouse as if reminding herself of the roles we were supposed to play. "Well," she said lightly, crisis averted. But when she handed me the candle, her fingers lingered just a second longer than necessary. And as she left, closing the door gently behind her, I sat staring at the flame, knowing we had crossed a line. Not one of words or actions, but one of silence, a boundary that could never be undone. The morning after the storm, the house felt different. It wasn't the power coming back or the quiet streets washed clean by the rain. It was something between us, something that hadn't existed before the candlelight and the brush of her hand against mine. I carried the weight of that touch with me all morning, replaying it in small flashes, the warmth of her skin, the way her eyes had lingered, the silence that had felt almost like a confession. But when I saw her later that day, she was different. She was watering the plants in the courtyard, her movements precise, almost rehearsed. She greeted me with a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. The warmth from the night before was gone, replaced by a kind of guarded restraint. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, hoping for a trace of the ease we'd shared. "Of course," she replied lightly, not looking up from the roses she was pruning. "It takes more than a storm to unsettle me." Her tone was pleasant, but it carried distance, like she had carefully drawn a line between us overnight. For the next few days, the shift grew clearer. Our conversations became shorter, her smiles briefer, her presence more elusive. It wasn't unkindness, she wasn't cold, just careful. As if she had remembered the roles we were supposed to play, landlady and tenant, older woman and younger man. One evening, unable to hold it in any longer, I found her in the kitchen rinsing teacups. The warm light from the lamp fell across her profile, outlining the curve of her cheek, the determined set of her mouth. "Did I do something wrong?" I asked quietly. She froze for a moment, then set the cup down gently. When she turned to face me, her expression was soft but tinged with conflict. "No. You've been nothing but kind." "Then why?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Why does it feel like you're keeping me at arm's length?" Her eyes dropped, and she gave a faint, almost sad smile. "Because I should." The words settled heavily between us. "I enjoy your company," she admitted after a pause, her voice lower, almost vulnerable. "More than I expected to. But I'm your landlady. And I'm older. These things matter, whether we want them to or not." I wanted to tell her it didn't matter. That the connection we shared had nothing to do with age or titles. But the way she said it, the quiet conviction in her tone, stopped me. Instead, I just nodded, though my chest ached. "I understand." She reached out then, as if to soften the blow, her fingers grazing my arm lightly before she pulled them back. That brief touch carried both comfort and apology, a silent acknowledgement of what neither of us dared to say aloud. The days that followed were filled with small reminders of her distance. She smiled, yes, but it was the kind of smile given out of politeness, not warmth. Her door closed a little quicker when I passed by. Our conversation skimmed the surface, avoiding the depth that once came so easily. Yet even in the restraint, there were cracks. A glance that lasted a second too long. A hesitation before she looked away. The faint scent of her perfume lingering in the stairwell long after she had gone upstairs. And those cracks were enough to keep hope alive, enough to remind me that beneath the careful guard she had built, the connection still pulsed, steady and undeniable. But I also knew something else: if either of us wanted this bond to become more than fragile moments, it would take a choice. A choice she wasn't ready to make. Not yet. The hesitation between us lingered for days, maybe even weeks, like an invisible curtain neither of us dared to pull aside. I went about my routine, work, study, coming back to the house in the evenings, but no matter how ordinary the day, she was there in the back of my mind. Her careful distance wasn't rejection, not really, it was fear. Fear of stepping into something that neither of us could easily define, something that defied the roles and rules we were expected to follow. Then came the night of the Lantern Festival. The town square was alive with color and sound, children chasing after glowing balloons, couples writing wishes on slips of paper before tying them to floating lanterns. I hadn't planned on going, but when she knocked on my door that evening, wearing a simple navy dress and carrying that same cautious smile, I couldn't say no. "It's been years since I've gone," she admitted as we walked side by side. "But it feels like a shame to stay inside on a night like this." I noticed the way her hair caught the glow of the streetlights, the way her eyes reflected the lanterns overhead. She wasn't dressed extravagantly, but something about her presence made the whole square feel quieter, calmer, even amid the laughter and music. We found a spot on a low stone wall at the edge of the festival, close enough to see the lanterns rise but far enough to escape the crowds. She handed me one of the slips of paper, her fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second that sent a familiar warmth through me. "Make a wish," she said. I looked at her instead of the paper. "What about you?" She smiled faintly. "I already know what mine is." We rode in silence, the night air filled with the sound of flutes and laughter, the soft crackle of lanterns being lit. When the time came, we both raised ours together, letting them float upward into the velvet sky. For a long moment, we just watched them rise, glowing softly like distant stars. It was then she spoke, her voice quieter than the music, almost swallowed by the night. "You make me feel young again," she said, still watching the lanterns. "Like I'm allowed to laugh too loud, or sit too close, or forget the numbers that are supposed to define me." I turned toward her. Her shoulders were relaxed, but her eyes shimmered with vulnerability. "I don't see numbers," I said softly. "I see you. The way you smile when you don't mean to. The way you make this house feel like more than walls and furniture. I see someone who makes me want to stay." For a moment, neither of us moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, and all the hesitation, all the careful distance, melted in her gaze. Her hand found mine, not by accident this time, but with intention. Her fingers threaded through mine, warm and steady. "Do you know what I wished for?" she asked. I shook my head, my voice caught in my chest. "That you wouldn't give up on me. Even if I stumble. Even if I hesitate again." I squeezed her hand gently, feeling a calm certainty wash over me. "Then your wish is safe with me." We sat there long after the lanterns had disappeared into the night, hand in hand, the silence between us no longer heavy with fear but light with promise. When she finally leaned her head against my shoulder, it wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was simple, natural, like two pieces finally fitting where they were always meant to. The stars above bore witness, the festival faded into the distance, and in that quiet, we both knew, whatever the future held, the smiles we shared would no longer be borrowed, or tentative. They would belong to us.